A poor girl dropped an ultrasound photo right at the feet of the millionaire CEO, and the date on it shocked him more than any betrayal. The lobby of Harrison Global was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Marble columns rose like guardians of wealth, polished floors reflected the gleam of chandeliers, and the air itself seemed to hum with the electricity of ambition. Assistants rushed from one elevator to another, their arms stacked with folders, while visitors craned their necks to take in the grandeur of one of Manhattan's most powerful companies. It was not just a lobby, it was a stage, and every person who stepped into it knew their role. Some bowed, some strutted, and most kept their eyes down. Through the revolving glass doors entered Jonathan Harrison. At 33, he was the youngest CEO to ever command a company of such scale, and he wore his power like a second skin. His navy suit was cut to perfection, his dark hair neatly styled, and his brown eyes sharp enough to slice through any pretense. He walked with the kind of assured stride that parted crowds without him ever asking. To most, he was untouchable, an empire in motion. At that same moment, near the reception desk, a woman struggled with a stack of documents in a worn handbag. Emily Carter was 30, and though she carried herself with quiet dignity, there was an exhaustion in her eyes that betrayed years of battles fought alone. She had not come here to be noticed. She had come because she had no choice. Yet fate rarely asked permission. As she adjusted her bag, an envelope slipped from her grasp, spilling its contents across the polished floor. Papers fanned out like fallen leaves, and amid them, one small gray and white sheet slid further than the rest. Emily froze. Her breath caught as her eyes fell on it. An ultrasound scan, the delicate image of a life not yet born. Panic surged through her. She dropped to her knees, desperately reaching to retrieve it before anyone saw. But someone already had. Jonathan, passing by with the unhurried air of a man who never stooped for anything, noticed the sheet glinting faintly on the floor. He bent and lifted it without thought, prepared to hand it back with a cool, dismissive word. Yet when his gaze fell on the image, his body stilled. His eyes locked on the numbers in the corner. The date. Time seemed to narrow, the bustling lobby fading into silence. The date burned into his mind like fire. It matched. The timing was exact. His breath caught as if someone had struck him in the chest. Emily's hand shot out to snatch the scan from him, her face drained of color. "Please, give it back," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. But Jonathan couldn't move. The world's most powerful man, the one who stared down boards and crushed rivals, now stood frozen in the middle of his own lobby, undone by a fragile piece of paper. His lips parted, but the words that emerged carried none of his usual authority. "This child," he said hoarsely, eyes flicking from the scan to her trembling face, "is mine." Emily shook her head, her eyes glistening with defiance and despair. "Number, you don't understand. I never wanted you to know. This isn't your burden." But the burden was already there, heavy and undeniable, pressing down on him with the weight of truth. The lobby buzzed back to life around them, but Jonathan no longer saw marble floors or gleaming chandeliers. He saw only the image in his hand, the life it represented, and the woman before him who had tried to carry it all alone. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Jonathan Harrison, CEO, millionaire, untouchable, felt his carefully ordered world crack. Jonathan did not sleep that night. His penthouse apartment stretched around him in gleaming silence, but the silence felt heavier than any boardroom filled with enemies. He sat in the dark with the ultrasound photograph on the table before him, the faint outline of a child staring back as if demanding an answer. His whiskey glass remained untouched. Even the burn of alcohol could not drown the storm inside him. He kept repeating the same thought, a sentence that had taken root and would not release him. "It's mine." He told himself it wasn't possible. He had built his life on certainty, control, and facts. Numbers always told the truth, and numbers had never betrayed him, until now. The date printed on the corner of the scan matched with merciless precision. Months earlier, the night at the charity gala replayed in his mind with startling clarity. He had told himself it had been insignificant, a fleeting moment of weakness with a woman whose sincerity disarmed him more than he wanted to admit. He had erased it from his life the next morning, as he always did with anything that might slow him down. But fate, it seemed, had refused to let him erase this. By dawn, his mind was raw from arguing with itself. He told himself it could be coincidence, that she could be lying, that the world was full of women who might invent such a story to trap a man like him. But when he remembered the look on Emily's face in the lobby, the fear, the exhaustion, the quiet steel, he knew she wasn't lying. She wasn't playing a game. She hadn't even wanted him to know. And somehow that truth cut deeper than any accusation. The following day at headquarters, he tried to bury himself in work. Contracts, negotiations, market forecasts, all the weapons that usually fortified him felt hollow in his hands. Words blurred on the screen. His assistants noticed his distraction, but none dared ask questions. Jonathan Harrison did not allow questions. Yet beneath his polished exterior, his pulse raced every time he thought of her. Every time he imagined that child, his child. By afternoon, he found himself outside the modest neighborhood where Emily lived. He told himself it was coincidence, that he had been drawn there out of curiosity, but the truth was far less comfortable. He needed answers. He parked his sleek car on the curb, out of place among the cracked sidewalks and old brick buildings. For a long while he sat behind the wheel, gripping it until his knuckles whitened. Approaching her door felt harder than any corporate conquest. When he finally knocked, Emily opened slowly, surprise and alarm flashing in her eyes. She wore no makeup, her hair tied back, her face pale from lack of sleep. Behind her, the apartment was simple, filled with the quiet signs of a woman preparing for motherhood. The sight disarmed him more than he cared to admit. "You shouldn't be here," she said quickly, stepping into the doorway, as if to block him. "I need to know," Jonathan replied, his voice low but urgent. "Is it true? Is it mine?" Her shoulders stiffened, but her eyes softened, betraying the pain she had carried alone. "Yes," she whispered, "it's yours. But I didn't want your money, your power, your world. I was ready to raise this child on my own." He felt as though she had struck him. In his life, everyone wanted something from him: contracts, influence, wealth. But here she was, offering nothing, asking for nothing, and that unsettled him more than all the schemes of his rivals combined. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, the edge in his voice faltering. "Because your life is built on steel and glass," she said, her eyes glistening. "And I didn't want my child to grow up invisible inside it. You don't know how to love without conditions, Jonathan. I won't let you treat this baby like another project you can control." The words hit him harder than the boardroom attacks he had faced all his career. He wanted to argue, to insist she was wrong. But deep inside, he feared she was right. He had never loved without conditions. He had never let anything or anyone matter more than the empire he had built. Jonathan left her apartment with the ultrasound photo burning in his pocket like a brand. For the first time in his life, he realized there were battles he could not fight with money or strategy. This was a war inside himself, and no amount of control could protect him from the truth. A child was coming. His child. And whether he was ready or not, the life he had so carefully built was already beginning to unravel. Jonathan tried to convince himself that work would heal the storm inside him. He buried his hours in board meetings, contracts, and expansion strategies, pushing his staff harder than ever. On the surface, he was the same Jonathan Harrison the world admired, decisive, confident, untouchable. But beneath the armor, the memories clawed their way back, louder with each day. Every time he tried to focus on numbers and deals, the image of that gray and white scan appeared before his eyes. A reminder that there was something growing in the world that no amount of money could erase. At night, he found himself restless in his penthouse, pacing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched below, a kingdom he had conquered with his will, yet he felt no triumph. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to the charity gala, months earlier, the night he had met Emily. He had not planned to notice her. He never planned to notice anyone. She had been standing near the edges of the ballroom, dressed simply compared to the glittering crowd. There was something in her quiet presence, in the way she listened rather than competed to be heard. When he approached, she hadn't fawned over him like the others. She had looked him in the eyes and asked a question no one else had ever dared. "Do you even like the life you've built?" He had laughed it off that night, masking his discomfort with charm. But the memory returned now with brutal clarity. She had seen through him before anyone else dared, and he had run from it, convincing himself it had been nothing more than a distraction. The connection they shared that night, brief, fiery, raw, was something he thought he could bury. But fate had ensured it lived on, in the child she carried. The pressure at Harrison Global only intensified. Word of the mysterious woman had begun to circle in hushed tones. Executives whispered when they thought he wasn't listening, speculating on whether their immaculate leader had made a mistake. His board, always ready to exploit weakness, grew restless. Victoria Ames, his sharpest and most ruthless director, cornered him after a meeting. "Jonathan," she said, her voice smooth as glass, "the rumors are spreading. Investors hate uncertainty. If there's even a grain of truth to this story, you must deal with it quietly. We cannot afford a scandal." "Quietly," he repeated, his jaw tightening. "Yes, discreet arrangements can always be made. A sum of money, a contract. You understand." Jonathan stared at her, his stomach twisting. Money had always been his weapon, his shield. But the idea of reducing his child, his blood, to a line item in his accounts sickened him in a way he hadn't expected. He dismissed Victoria coldly, but the unease gnawed deeper. That night he returned to Emily's apartment unannounced, unable to resist the pull. The building was small, the hallway dim, a stark contrast to the world of polished steel he ruled. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her face, followed by guarded resignation. "You shouldn't be here," she said again, though her voice was softer than before. "I can't stop thinking about it," Jonathan admitted, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. "About you, about the baby, about that night. I keep trying to convince myself this isn't real, that I can control it the way I control everything else. But I can't." Emily's eyes softened for a moment, but then she shook her head. "You think you can just walk into this and fix it with money or power? But this isn't another deal, Jonathan. This is a child, a human being. And you—" She hesitated, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't know what love without conditions feels like. And that's what this baby will need." Her words cut deeper than any business rival ever had. Jonathan wanted to argue, to insist that he could change, that he was capable of more than she believed. But deep inside, a terrifying truth clawed at him. What if she was right? What if the only thing he knew how to do was win and control, not love and nurture? He left her building that night with her words echoing in his mind, heavy and merciless. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Harrison felt powerless. The empire he had built meant nothing against the fragile life he had helped create, and the realization shook him more than any corporate war ever had. As he stood outside on the cracked sidewalk, staring up at the modest apartment window, where Emily's light still glowed, he realized that his greatest battle was no longer with rivals or markets. It was with himself, and it was a battle he did not yet know how to fight. The first cracks appeared not in Jonathan's empire of glass and steel, but in the whispers that flowed through it. Whispers could move faster than any memo, faster than the elevators that shot up and down Harrison Global's tower. They lived in the corners of conference rooms, in the pauses at water coolers, in the lowered voices of assistants who swore they saw something they weren't meant to. And now the whispers had a name: Emily Carter. No one knew the full story, but fragments of rumor had begun to paint their own portrait. A photograph of Jonathan in the lobby, holding what looked like a medical scan, a woman with tired eyes who wasn't part of their world. Dates and timelines that didn't add up neatly, the kind that bred speculation. By the time the week was out, entire departments were buzzing with theories that the CEO had a secret mistress, that there was a child, that the perfect Jonathan Harrison had stumbled. The press wasn't far behind. A gossip column appeared first, tucked at the bottom of an online finance page. Powerhouse CEO linked to mystery woman. It should have been nothing, a throwaway article that usually vanished in hours. But in Jonathan's world, nothing went unnoticed. By morning, the article had been screenshotted, circulated, dissected in investor chats. Journalists began calling the corporate communications office, demanding a statement. Jonathan sat in his glass office high above the city, his jaw tight as his PR director laid out the coverage on his desk. Headlines that toyed with his name, photographs of him entering and leaving his building, and worst of all, a grainy image of Emily leaving her apartment with a protective hand over her stomach. "We need to respond," the director urged carefully. "Deny, clarify, something." Jonathan's fingers curled against the edge of his desk. His instinct was silence, control, the art of waiting until the noise died down. But this wasn't market fluctuation or a hostile takeover. This was his life, bleeding into the open. And it wasn't just his anymore. By the end of the week, the board demanded a private session. He walked into the conference room, his face carved into the familiar mask of power, but he could feel the shift. The directors looked at him not with admiration, but with suspicion. Sharks circling blood. Victoria Ames was the first to speak, her voice smooth, her eyes sharp as a blade. Jonathan, we've always respected your leadership, but this situation is unacceptable. Investors are nervous. They want stability, not scandal. It's my private life, Jonathan replied, his voice steady but quiet with restrained anger. When your private life bleeds into headlines that affect stock prices, it becomes corporate business, Victoria countered. You must settle this, quickly, quietly. Money always solves these things. The other directors nodded. To them it was simple. Write a check, make the woman disappear, restore the image. They looked at him expectantly, as if the answer should be obvious. But Jonathan sat in silence, their words echoing around him. He saw Emily's face in his mind, pale but proud, her voice trembling but steady as she said, I don't want your money. I won't let you treat this baby like a project. He had dismissed rivals, silenced critics, crushed competitors without hesitation. But now he felt something unfamiliar rising inside him. Not calculation, not strategy, but resistance. No, he said finally, his voice hardening. I won't pay her off. I won't erase her. And I will not deny my child. The boardroom erupted with protests, voices overlapping, panic lacing their words. But Jonathan's decision stood. For once, his empire of control bowed to something deeper, something even he didn't fully understand. That night, when the city glowed beneath his penthouse, Jonathan stood alone before the windows. The skyline stretched endlessly, but he felt the walls closing in. His phone buzzed with messages from lawyers and advisors, but he ignored them. He thought instead of Emily, how she had stood in her small apartment doorway, shielding herself from him, yet telling him the truth he hadn't wanted to hear. For the first time, Jonathan realized that the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. And this time, his money, his power, his empire might not be enough to hold it back. Jonathan had spent his entire adult life in control of storms. In hostile takeovers, in courtroom battles, in the deadly politics of corporate warfare, he had always known how to bend chaos to his will. But now, for the first time, he was living inside a storm that refused to obey him. By the second week after the whispers became headlines, Emily's life had become unrecognizable. Her modest apartment was no longer a refuge. Journalists parked outside in vans, their cameras pointed at her door, waiting for her to emerge. Neighbors whispered, some with pity, some with judgment, as she hurried past with her coat pulled tightly around her. Even the grocery store had turned hostile. The cashier had glanced at her stomach, then at the tabloid folded by the register, and smirked as though she were a scandal to be rung up along with the milk and bread. One afternoon, Jonathan arrived at her apartment unannounced and found her sitting at her kitchen table, with her head buried in her hands. On the table lay the latest issue of a business magazine, his face on the cover beneath the words, "The CEO's Hidden Mistake." Emily's shoulders shook. She wasn't crying, not quite, but the silence around her was too heavy to bear. "Emily," he said softly, stepping into the room. She lifted her head, her eyes tired but burning. "You shouldn't be here. Every time you show up, they swarm worse. You don't understand. My life isn't built for this. I can't breathe anymore." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Then let me protect you. Come with me. I can move you into a place where they can't touch you." Her laugh was short and bitter. "A gilded cage in your tower? No, thank you. I don't need bodyguards and bulletproof glass. I need peace, and you don't know how to give that to anyone." The words stung, but Jonathan didn't flinch. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know how to fight. And right now, whether you like it or not, you are in the middle of a fight. I won't let them tear you apart." For a long moment, Emily stared at him, her lips pressed tight, her fingers trembling against the magazine cover. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave, to slam the door between them and keep raising her child alone, as she had always planned. But another part, a fragile, desperate part, was too tired to push him away anymore. That same week, Jonathan faced his board again. The directors were relentless. They demanded he issue a formal denial, distance himself from Emily, make the problem disappear. Victoria Ames in particular pressed harder than anyone else, her words dripping with feigned concern but laced with ambition. Jonathan, the market doesn't forgive weakness. If you let this narrative take root, you'll be remembered not as a visionary, but as a scandal. You'll lose everything you've built. He looked around the long table at faces he had commanded for years, men and women who had once admired his ruthless precision. Now they saw vulnerability and wanted blood. He could almost hear their thoughts. Step down. Give us someone stronger. Give us someone clean. Jonathan stood slowly, his palms pressed to the table. His voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to prove. You think this is weakness, when he said, his eyes scanning each of them. You think acknowledging my child, acknowledging the truth, will destroy me. But what destroys a man is not truth, it's fear. And I'm done being afraid. The room fell silent. Even Victoria had no ready retort. For the first time, Jonathan wasn't speaking as their CEO. He was speaking as a man, and it unsettled them because it made him unpredictable. That night, he returned to Emily again. This time, instead of arguments, he brought groceries in his arms, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up like a man stepping into a life he had never lived before. She blinked in shock when he set the bags on her counter and began unpacking them with an ease that felt alien in her kitchen. "What are you doing?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Making dinner," he replied simply. "I haven't done it in years, but I remember enough." And for the first time, Emily saw him not as the billionaire whose world had swallowed hers, but as a man fumbling with pasta and sauce, determined to be present even when he didn't know how. Something inside her shifted, though she tried hard to ignore it. The world outside still circled like vultures, hungry for their downfall. But in that small apartment, as Jonathan burned the garlic and swore under his breath while Emily almost smiled, the storm quieted just enough for both of them to breathe. It was messy, it was fragile, and it was real. The night it happened, the city was alive with flashing lights and restless noise. But inside Emily's apartment, the world had narrowed to four walls, and a storm neither of them could control. She had been restless all day, pacing, her hand pressed to the small of her back, her breaths uneven. Jonathan had insisted on staying, refusing to let her face the suffocating crowd of reporters alone. He had spent the evening by the window, staring at the swarm of cameras outside, their flashes punctuating the dark like lightning. Then Emily gasped. It wasn't the soft intake of surprise he had grown used to. It was sharp, guttural, pulled from somewhere deep. She gripped the table, her knuckles white, her body bowing forward. Jonathan was at her side in an instant, his composure shattering as he saw her face contorted in pain. "Emily?" His voice, usually steady as iron, shook. Her eyes squeezed shut. "It's starting," she whispered, the words trembling. "The baby. It's coming." Time, for a moment, seemed to collapse around him. The CEO who had faced down billion-dollar deals, who had stared his enemies in the eye without blinking, felt his chest constrict. Nothing, no contract, no negotiation, had prepared him for this. "I'll call an ambulance," he said, fumbling for his phone. But she shook her head violently, clutching his sleeve. "No, they're out there. The press, the cameras. I won't give birth in front of the world like I'm some spectacle." Jonathan looked toward the window, at the horde beyond, and for the first time in his life, hatred seared through him. Not for rivals, not for competitors, but for the vultures, waiting to feast on her pain. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, making a decision without hesitation. "Then we'll go ourselves," he said firmly. "Trust me." He helped her down the stairs, his arm wrapped tightly around her, shielding her body with his own as they slipped out through the back exit. The night air was bitter, filled with the echo of distant shouts and the clicking of cameras they barely evaded. Emily's breaths grew shorter, sharper, as he guided her into his car and sped through the streets. The skyscrapers blurred by, the traffic lights bleeding red and green across the windshield. But all he saw was her clenched jaw, the sweat beading on her forehead, the silent strength she clung to even as the pain racked her body. "Breathe, Emily," he urged, his own voice breaking. "Stay with me. We're almost there." At the hospital, chaos swallowed them. Doctors and nurses rushed them into a room, their words a blur of instructions and reassurances. Jonathan found himself standing at her side, his hand captured in hers with a grip that could have broken bone. He welcomed the pain. It tethered him to her, to the moment, to the truth he had been running from for months. Hours stretched like years. Emily cried out, sweat soaking her hair, her body trembling with each wave of agony. Jonathan never let go of her hand. He whispered to her, nonsense words, promises he wasn't sure he was worthy of making, but needed to say. At one point, when she was too weak to answer, he bent close to her ear. "You're not alone," he whispered. "Not anymore. I swear it, Emily. I'm here. I'm not leaving." Finally, when it seemed her strength was nearly gone, a cry split the room. A small, raw, perfect cry that cut through everything. The fear, the pain, the storm outside. The doctor lifted a tiny, wriggling infant into the air, and for the first time Jonathan saw his daughter. His knees nearly gave out. He felt something inside him shatter and rebuild all at once. She's ours," he whispered, his voice ragged. Emily lay back, exhausted, tears sliding down her temples, but her eyes found his. For the first time, there was no distance between them, no armor, no walls, just two broken souls, bound together by the fragile miracle between them. Jonathan took the baby in his arms, his hands trembling despite all the strength he had used to build his empire. He stared down at her tiny face, her fists curled, her eyes closed, and felt a weight heavier than any deal he had ever signed. But it wasn't the crushing weight of responsibility, it was the grounding weight of love. In that sterile hospital room, with the city's chaos kept at bay by thin walls, Jonathan Harrison, CEO, millionaire, conqueror, was remade. Not by power, not by victory, but by the tiny heartbeat pressed against his chest and the woman who had brought her into the world. And as he stood there, tears finally breaking free, he knew with absolute certainty this was the only deal that would ever matter. The news of the birth spread faster than Jonathan could have imagined. Within hours of Emily being discharged, photographs of her leaving the hospital, pale, exhausted, but holding a tiny bundle in her arms, were plastered across the front pages of newspapers and digital feeds. "Harrison heir born in secret," one headline screamed. "CEO's hidden family revealed," another declared. Paparazzi swarmed like hornets, their lenses capturing every moment. Emily shielding the baby's face, Jonathan guiding her firmly into a waiting car. What should have been the most sacred private moment of their lives became a public spectacle, devoured by strangers who wanted nothing more than to dissect their vulnerability. Inside Harrison Global, the boardroom was a battlefield. The directors were livid, furious at the images, the implications, the damage to their carefully cultivated reputation. Victoria Ames, sharper than ever, slammed her hand against the polished mahogany table. "This is a disaster," she spat. "We gave you the chance to settle this quietly, Jonathan. Now the entire world is talking about your illegitimate child. Investors are pulling out. The stock price has dipped 3 points, and you've dragged this company into your mess." Jonathan sat at the head of the table, his face carved into calm, but the fire in his eyes betrayed him. For once, he didn't let them speak over him. He stood, his voice low but commanding, cutting through their outrage like a blade. "No," he said. "What I've done is tell the truth. You want to call her illegitimate? She is my daughter, my blood. And if the price of admitting that is losing your respect, then so be it." A murmur rippled through the room. Some directors averted their eyes, others glared with thinly veiled contempt. But Jonathan didn't waver. For years, he had ruled this board with cold strategy and unflinching logic. Now he stood before them as something they could not control, a man willing to sacrifice his empire rather than deny his family. When the meeting ended, the directors filed out in uneasy silence, leaving only Jonathan staring down at the city below. He knew the path ahead would be brutal, but for the first time he welcomed the fight. Meanwhile, Emily struggled to adjust to her new reality. The small apartment that had once been her refuge now felt like a cage of flashing lights and shouted questions. Every outing was a gauntlet of reporters. Every phone call from an unknown number felt like another intrusion. She held her daughter close, whispering promises of safety even as her own fear grew heavier. Jonathan visited nightly, sometimes in his suit, sometimes stripped of it, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. exhaustion clinging to his features. But no matter how weary he was, he carried groceries, bottles, or simply stood at the crib, watching the baby breathe. Emily found herself caught between gratitude and suspicion. He was still the man who had once mocked her world, still the figure of power she distrusted, but he was also the man who rocked their daughter to sleep with hands too gentle for someone known as ruthless. One evening, as she nursed the baby in the dim light of the living room, she spoke without looking at him. "They're destroying me, Jonathan. Every time I step outside, it feels like I'm drowning in their voices. I can't live like this." He moved closer, his voice steady. "Then don't. Move in with me. Not into the tower, not into the board's world. My home. Let me protect you." Emily looked up, startled. "And then what? I become the woman the tabloids call your mistake? The one who ruined the empire?" He knelt in front of her, his brown eyes locked onto hers with a fierceness she had never seen. "You're not a mistake, and she's not a scandal. She's the only thing in my life that isn't hollow. I won't let them write that story for us." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The baby stirred softly in Emily's arms, her tiny fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. Jonathan reached out, hesitating for the first time in years, then gently placed his hand over Emily's, steadying both her and the child. In that moment, something shifted. The walls of fear and pride that had kept them apart began to crack. Emily saw not the CEO, not the millionaire, not the man who once terrified her with his power, but a father stripped raw, fighting for a place in the life he had helped create. Outside, the world raged with cameras and accusations. Inside, in the small circle of lamplight, the three of them breathed together, fragile but unbreakable. Jonathan knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The board would push back harder, the press would hunt deeper, and the empire he had built might crumble beneath the weight of scandal. But as he looked at Emily and their daughter, he understood something with a clarity sharper than any business plan. He had already made his choice. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Harrison chose love over power. The storm reached its peak on a gray morning when Jonathan walked into the boardroom, knowing it might be the last time he entered as CEO. The table was crowded with directors, their faces grim, their voices low, their eyes sharpening like knives. Reports of falling stock prices lay scattered across the polished wood, alongside printouts of headlines that screamed about scandal and betrayal. Victoria Ames sat at the far end, her smile thin, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who believed she was about to witness his downfall. "Jonathan," she began smoothly, "we've indulged your personal distractions long enough. The board cannot allow this company to be destroyed by your recklessness. We're prepared to vote for your removal unless you make a statement today. Deny the child, sever ties with this woman, and restore the company's image." The words fell into the silence like stones into water. For years, Jonathan would have responded with a calculated strategy, a compromise, a maneuver to secure his position. But that man, the one who clung to power as if it were oxygen, was gone. He rose slowly, buttoning his jacket, his posture regal but his eyes burning with something the board had never seen in him before. Defiance laced with truth. "I built this empire," he said evenly, "brick by brick, deal by deal, sacrifice after sacrifice. And you think you can hold it over my head like a leash. But you're wrong. This company doesn't define me. Not anymore." Murmurs broke out, shocked, unsettled. He continued, his voice rising with the weight of conviction. "Yes, I have a daughter. She is mine, and I will never deny her. And Emily," his voice softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again, "is not a liability to be erased, not a scandal to be bought off. She is the mother of my child and the only person who has ever looked me in the eye and told me the truth without fear. That makes her worth more than every one of you sitting here pretending loyalty while sharpening knives behind my back." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Victoria's face darkened, her lips curling. "Then you're finished here," she snapped. Jonathan allowed himself a faint smile. "If that's what it takes to be a father, then yes, I am finished." He left the boardroom with his head high, the empire he had bled for crumbling behind him. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel loss. He felt freedom. Outside, the press was waiting, a sea of microphones and flashing cameras. Questions screamed at him, accusations hurled like stones. Jonathan stepped up to the podium they had erected, not for him but against him, and lifted his hand for silence. "I am Jonathan Harrison," he declared, his voice carrying over the chaos. "I am a father. I have a daughter, and I will not hide her, deny her, or let the world turn her into a scandal. If that means I lose your approval, your investments, your headlines, so be it. Because for the first time in my life, I have something worth protecting. And I will not fail her." The crowd erupted, some in outrage, some in shock, some even in reluctant admiration. But Jonathan didn't stay to measure their reaction. He turned, walked through the crowd, and got into his car. His destination was not the tower, not the empire he had left behind. It was the small apartment where Emily sat by the window, cradling their child. When he arrived, she looked up in disbelief. He stood in the doorway, no longer the untouchable CEO, but a man stripped bare. "They pushed me to choose," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "And I chose you. I chose her." Emily's eyes filled with tears, not of fear this time, but of something softer, something she had fought to keep buried. She rose, the baby in her arms, and for the first time she didn't put a wall between them. She let him step forward, let him wrap his arms around them both, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. Weeks passed and the world adjusted. The scandal did not vanish, but slowly it faded into something else. Investors stabilized, not out of trust in Jonathan's empire, but out of reluctant respect for his unshakable honesty. Articles shifted from condemnation to fascination. The CEO who chose fatherhood over fortune? Some called him reckless, others called him courageous. Jonathan didn't care. In Emily's apartment, laughter began to echo where silence had once reigned. He traded late nights in boardrooms for sleepless nights rocking his daughter. He burned dinners in her kitchen, learned how to change diapers with hands that had once only signed contracts worth billions, and discovered that the sound of his baby's cry carried more weight than the approval of shareholders. One evening, as the city glowed beyond the window, Emily stood beside him, their daughter asleep between them. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Walking away from all of it?" Jonathan looked down at the tiny face of his child, then at Emily's tired but radiant eyes. He shook his head slowly, a smile curving across his lips. "No," he said. "For the first time, I don't regret anything at all." And in that small room, lit by the golden haze of the city outside, the man who had once ruled an empire of glass and steel discovered the one truth that had eluded him all his life. That love, fragile and imperfect, was stronger than power. The empire was gone, but in its place stood something unshakable, a family. And for Jonathan Harrison, that was the only victory that ever mattered. The ending of this story strikes me with its humanity. The protagonist, a millionaire CEO, accustomed to a world of numbers, power, and flawless control, embarks on the hardest journey of his life, learning to be vulnerable. At the beginning, he appears unshakable, but the fall of a single ultrasound photo shatters his carefully constructed reality. For me, the conclusion is not about loss, but about gain. He loses influence in part of his empire, but he gains far more. A daughter, a woman brave enough to live honestly, and the chance to be real. His defeat in the eyes of the board or the market becomes his greatest victory as a man. Emily also undergoes her own transformation. At first, she wanted to protect herself and remain alone, convinced that love could not be genuine. But the ending shows that sometimes in the most unexpected places, one can find support in a true family. To me, this story is about how real strength is not found in millions or in a CEO's chair, but in the ability to take responsibility and love without conditions. The ending leaves a sense of hope. If even a man locked in the armor of power could open up and change, then there is a chance for everyone.